He woke up to the soft sound of birds outside his window. The sunlight filtered gently through the blinds, casting thin lines across the room. It was another ordinary morning in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The streets weren't busy yet, just the occasional car passing by and the distant laughter of children on their way to school. He sat up on the edge of his bed, stretched his arms, and took a deep breath. Life felt calm today, peaceful in a way he had almost forgotten existed. He had lived in this house for several years. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was his sanctuary, a place where he could finally be alone with his thoughts, away from the chaos of his past. Every corner of the house carried memories of quiet evenings, moments spent with a cup of coffee and hours lost in books. He had worked hard to create this small world for himself, a world where no one knew who he truly was. He had left that life behind long ago, or so he thought. Downstairs, the coffee machine whirred to life. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint aroma of toast. He moved slowly, letting the warmth of the morning soak into his body. Outside, the neighborhood seemed calm, almost sleepy. But beneath that calm, he could feel the tension that often lingered in this part of the city. He had learned over the years to read it, the subtle signs that told him trouble could be close. He shook his head slightly, pushing the thought away. Today was supposed to be ordinary. Today he could just be a man enjoying his morning. He walked over to the window, peering out at the street. The houses across the road were tidy, their lawns neatly trimmed. A few neighbors were already outside, waving at each other or sweeping their driveways. He nodded back, polite but distant. People didn't know him well, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He had learned that privacy was a gift, something you protected fiercely. Some people here were friendly, some kept to themselves, and a few carried an edge in their eyes. He had learned to be careful with all of them, to trust only when it was absolutely necessary. After breakfast, he went through his usual routine. A quick jog around the block to stretch his legs, a few push-ups, then a cold shower to wake himself fully. His body moved with precision, every motion smooth and deliberate. It surprised many to see how fit he was for a man who appeared so ordinary. Few could guess the hours he had spent perfecting his skills, the discipline that had become part of his very being. Today, though, it was just exercise, just a way to keep himself healthy and awake, nothing more. As he walked back toward his house, he noticed a group of young men across the street. They were laughing loudly, their voices carrying on the wind. There was something in their manner, something rough and careless, that made him pause. He watched them for a moment, noting their movements, their faces. They didn't seem dangerous yet, just loud and reckless. But he had learned to notice details others missed, to sense when something might turn ugly. He shook his head again. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another group of kids being kids. Inside, he settled into his favorite chair, a worn leather seat by the window. He opened a book but didn't read for long. His mind kept drifting, memories of the past intruding despite his efforts to focus on the present. There were moments he wished he could forget, moments that had shaped him into the man he was today. He had faced dangers most people couldn't imagine, survived situations that would have broken others, and yet, here he was, living quietly, blending into a world that would never understand what he had endured. The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He answered, and it was a neighbor, a kind elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She wanted to borrow some sugar. He smiled as he listened, agreeing without hesitation. These small connections, these simple exchanges, were what made life bearable sometimes. He liked being part of the community, even if only in small ways. It reminded him that there was more to life than survival, more than being constantly alert. There was warmth, too, in moments like this. After hanging up, he glanced out the window again. The young men had disappeared, and the street was quiet once more. He felt a small sense of relief, though he didn't fully understand why. His instincts were never wrong, and sometimes that alone was enough to keep him on edge. He moved through the house, checking locks, making sure everything was secure. It was a habit now, one born from years of training and experience. Security wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. As the day went on, he went about his errands. A quick trip to the grocery store, picking up essentials. He smiled at the cashier, exchanged a few words with the other shoppers. Life here was ordinary, almost peaceful, and he savored it. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew that peace was fragile. It could be shattered in an instant, and he had learned to expect it. Still, he didn't let fear rule him. He moved through the world with calm confidence, careful but not fearful, aware but not anxious. Returning home, he decided to spend some time in the backyard. The garden wasn't large, but it was his refuge. A few flowers, a small patch of vegetables, and a single tree that had grown tall over the years. He liked to tend to it, to feel the earth in his hands, to watch life grow. It reminded him that life could be simple, beautiful, and enduring even when the world outside was harsh and unpredictable. He watered the plants slowly, savoring the quiet, the sunshine, the gentle breeze. As afternoon approached, he prepared a small meal for himself. Nothing fancy, just a plate of food he enjoyed. He sat by the window, eating slowly, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing, a dog barking, a car passing by, the ordinary rhythms of life, things most people took for granted. He appreciated them more than anyone could know because he had seen a world far different from this one. A world filled with danger, unpredictability, and life or death decisions. He finished his meal and leaned back in his chair. He looked around his house at the familiar objects and furniture, at the small details that made this place his own. He felt a sense of gratitude, quiet but deep. For all the hardships he had endured, for all the battles he had fought and survived, he had carved out a place of peace for himself. A place where he could simply be a man, not a soldier, not a hero, just a human being living his life. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. He closed the blinds slightly, letting the golden light filter softly into the room. He could hear footsteps outside, neighbors returning from their day, the hum of life continuing around him. For a moment, he allowed himself to forget the past, to forget the skills and training that had defined him for so long. For a moment, he let himself simply exist in this quiet, ordinary life. But even as he sat there, a part of him remained alert. Years of experience had taught him that danger could appear without warning, that calm could be deceptive. He didn't fear it. He simply recognized it. He trusted his instincts because they had never failed him. And yet, he hoped that today, this ordinary day, would remain just that. As night approached, he prepared for bed, following his routine carefully. Locking doors, checking windows, ensuring everything was in order. The house was quiet, the street calm, and for now there was peace. He lay down, letting the soft sheets wrap around him, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to drift, comforted by the ordinary, by the simple rhythm of life that he had fought so hard to protect. Little did he know, this calm was fragile. Outside, beyond the fences and the quiet streets, there were people who saw his life not as a story of peace but as an opportunity. They did not understand who he was or what he was capable of. They only saw a man living alone in a modest house, unaware that the calm surface hid a depth of skill, discipline, and power that very few in the world could comprehend. And so he slept, unaware that the ordinary life he cherished so deeply was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The evening started quietly, just as it had in the past few days. The sky was painted with soft oranges and pinks as the sun began its slow descent, and the neighborhood hummed with the usual sounds of life winding down. Children ran along the sidewalks, calling out to each other before heading inside, and a few neighbors were still outside, finishing chores or chatting quietly. He was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cooling air and the gentle hum of the world around him. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But normal was fragile. He didn't know it yet, but trouble was already moving toward him. Across the street, a group of men gathered in a small, tight circle, their voices low but tense. They were strangers to most of the neighborhood, strangers who moved through the streets like predators, scanning and plotting. Their eyes lingered on his house, sharp and calculating, as if they could see something no one else could. He wouldn't have noticed them at first, except that his instincts had learned to catch even the smallest signs of danger. At first, it was subtle. A shadow moving across his lawn, the sound of tires crunching against gravel, the faint echo of laughter that didn't belong to children. He sensed it before he understood it, a tension that didn't belong. Something was off. His hand went to the railing of the porch, gripping it slightly tighter, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. Then it happened. The first loud crash broke the calm. A baseball bat slammed into the side of his house, sending a spray of splinters into the air. He jumped to his feet, heart pounding as more loud hits followed. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the neighborhood. Windows shattered one by one as the group of men attacked, their faces twisted in anger and hatred. He moved instinctively, not out of fear, but because his body remembered what it had been trained to do. He ducked behind the porch railing, watching as they tore through the property. The door was kicked, splintering at the edges. Graffiti was scrawled across the walls in hateful words, mocking and cruel. Every detail was deliberate, meant to scare, meant to intimidate. But he did not panic. Panic was for the untrained, for those who did not know how to survive. He was different. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, some cautiously, others with a mix of fear and anger. A few shouted at the attackers, but they ignored the voices, focused entirely on destruction. Cars on the street slowed down as people leaned out of windows, unsure what to do. The scene was chaotic, frightening, and tense. And yet through it all he remained calm, observing, analyzing, planning. The attackers moved through the house, tossing furniture, smashing anything of value. He could hear them laughing as they destroyed what he had built. A cruel mix of satisfaction and malice in their voices. He didn't move yet. He didn't need to. Each second that passed, he gathered information. How many there were, how they moved, where their weaknesses might be. Years of training had taught him to remain patient in the face of chaos, to wait for the right moment to act. A chair flew through the air and hit the wall near him. The sound was deafening, but he did not flinch. He stayed low, keeping his breathing steady. The attackers were confident, thinking the man inside was defenseless, thinking he could intimidate him easily. They were wrong. One of the men tried to force the front door open fully, laughing as he kicked it. The sound of the wood splintering echoed through the street. That was the moment he decided to act. Not with brute force, not yet, but with careful observation. He noticed their pattern, how they moved in groups of 2 or 3, how their attention was divided between destruction and each other. He began moving silently through his house, slipping from room to room like a shadow, unseen and unnoticed. The attackers didn't realize he was inside, watching, calculating. He could see every detail, the way one of them held the bat too tightly, the way another paused to taunt a neighbor. These small movements, these tiny mistakes, told him everything he needed to know. And yet he still did not engage directly. He had learned that rushing in recklessly could turn a manageable situation into a deadly one. He would wait for the right moment when the advantage was entirely his. Outside, the neighborhood was in shock. People whispered to each other, unsure whether to call the police or stay hidden. Some wanted to intervene, but fear held them back. It was clear this was no ordinary vandalism. This was targeted, calculated, and fueled by hate. And while everyone else saw only chaos, he saw opportunity. He moved to the kitchen, quietly assessing a path through the house that would give him the most advantage. The layout of his home, the furniture, even the small items in the room were all tools in his mind. He could use shadows, walls, and corners to stay hidden while keeping the attackers in his view. His calmness contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. This was not fear. It was control, something he had mastered long ago. Suddenly a loud crash came from the back of the house. One of the attackers had thrown a chair through the window, sending shards of glass everywhere. He didn't react violently, but he made a mental note. Their overconfidence was their weakness. They underestimated him completely. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and that ignorance would cost them. He could hear footsteps moving across the living room floor, trashing bookshelves, overturning tables. He stayed low, listening carefully, each sound giving him more information. One of the men moved toward the staircase, seemingly intending to check upstairs. That would be the first critical mistake. He remained calm, letting the moment pass. There was no need to rush. He knew their patterns, their numbers, their tendencies. Each second of observation added to the advantage he would use. And yet as he watched, he felt a quiet anger stir inside him. Not blind rage, but a controlled fire. They had crossed a line, invaded his home, threatened his life and the life of anyone who might be there. They had no idea the storm they had triggered. Outside, one of the neighbors finally called the police. The voice on the other end sounded calm but strained, explaining the situation. But even as he listened, he knew help would not arrive in time. This was something he would have to handle himself. The police could respond, but they did not understand what they were walking into. They did not know who he really was, what he was capable of. He did not worry about that. He had survived far worse, and tonight would be no different. The attackers began to argue among themselves, their voices rising. One accused another of missing a valuable item. Another laughed too loudly at the destruction. Their focus was fractured, their attention divided. This was exactly what he needed. Patience had brought him to the perfect moment. He moved silently to the staircase, careful to avoid broken glass and scattered debris. He positioned himself above them, unseen, unnoticed, a shadow ready to strike if needed. He did not make a sound. He only observed, learning their strengths and weaknesses, noticing which of them led and which followed. He was invisible, yet he was in control. The attackers continued their destruction, unaware of the quiet presence above them. They laughed, they mocked, they celebrated their small victories. But each action revealed more of their nature. Some were reckless, others cautious, some easily distracted. He stored it all in his mind, every detail, every mistake. Finally, the chaos slowed slightly as they began to argue over what to destroy next. One of them gestured toward the back door, planning an exit route. Another suggested they finish inside before leaving. They were indecisive, sloppy, overconfident. He knew that within minutes they would make another mistake, one they would not live to regret, at least not without learning the hard way. He stayed quiet, heart steady, breathing controlled. Every second of calm observation added to his advantage. He didn't move unless he needed to, didn't act unless the moment demanded it. This was not fear. It was control, discipline, and strategy. It was everything he had trained for, everything he had survived before distilled into a single, precise awareness of the situation, and then, as he watched them plan their next move, he smiled quietly to himself. They had no idea what was coming. They thought they were in control, that they were untouchable. But they were wrong. Every step they took, every careless action was leading them straight into his plan. The night had begun as calm, peaceful, ordinary. But the ordinary was gone now, shattered along with the windows and furniture. Chaos had arrived at his doorstep, and yet he remained calm. Because this was not just a home under attack. This was a test. And he had spent a lifetime preparing for tests like this, even if no one knew it. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood faded slightly, drowned by the chaos of the attack. But inside, he moved quietly, observing, waiting, preparing. The attackers had crossed a line, and soon, they would discover that their arrogance and hate had placed them in the hands of a man they did not understand. Tonight would change everything. The night air was thick with tension. Inside the house, he moved silently, a shadow slipping between the shattered furniture and scattered debris. The attackers had grown careless, their laughter and shouting echoing through the rooms, and he took note of every sound. Every movement, every word told him more about their intentions, their weaknesses, and the mistakes they were making. He had remained hidden, patient, letting their arrogance guide him. For a moment, he allowed himself to think back to his past. Memories he had long buried began to surface. The quiet life he had built for himself now contrasted sharply with the life he had once lived. A life that had shaped him into a man capable of surviving anything. He remembered the grueling training, the endless drills, the discipline that became second nature. He remembered missions where one wrong move meant death, missions where he had relied on nothing but his skill, his mind, and his instincts. He had chosen to leave that life behind. It was not because he feared it, but because he wanted something else. A life where he could be just a man, not a soldier, not a weapon. He had come to value peace, simplicity, and the small joys of everyday life. And yet here he was, faced with a threat that tested every skill he thought he had left behind. The attackers had no idea who they had provoked, and that ignorance gave him the advantage. He paused near the stairs, listening carefully. One of the men had moved to the second floor, apparently trying to check the bedrooms. Another leaned against a wall, laughing too loudly, while a third shouted instructions to the rest. Each of their mistakes built a picture in his mind, a map of errors he could exploit. Patience had always been his ally, and tonight it served him well. He began to move deliberately, quietly navigating the house with the grace of someone who had done this countless times before. His hands brushed against walls and furniture, using every object to shield himself from sight. Broken glass crunched softly underfoot, but he adjusted his step, distributing his weight carefully to avoid drawing attention. Every move was calculated, precise. Every sense was alert. He could hear the subtle changes in their breathing, the slight shift in their stance, the rhythm of their attention as they continued to destroy his home. A flashback came to him suddenly. A mission overseas. A raid in a foreign city, where he had to move silently through enemy territory, observe every detail and strike only when it was perfect. He realized how much that training still lived within him, how naturally his body and mind responded to the chaos around him. He was calm now, controlled, fully aware of his surroundings. Fear had no place here. Only strategy mattered. He reached the top of the stairs and peeked around the corner. One of the men was approaching, looking down, oblivious to the silent figure above. He could see the tension in the man's movements, the slight hesitation and the overconfidence that came from thinking he was safe. A smile crossed his face, not cruel but knowing. They had underestimated him completely, and underestimating him would be their greatest mistake. He retreated slightly, remaining hidden as the man continued to move through the hallway. He noticed the layout of their positions, their distance from each other, their gaps in awareness, the predictable paths they took. It was all instinct now, honed through years of experience. Every second spent watching and learning increased the odds in his favor. He did not rush. He waited for the moment when their errors would allow him to act with precision. He remembered the training that had saved him so many times, the focus on observation, the emphasis on patience, the control of adrenaline. He could feel his pulse steady, his breathing slow as if he were watching the scene from a distance. Each attacker was a puzzle, and he knew exactly how to solve it. He had been a Navy SEAL, one of the best, and though he had left that life behind, the skills never truly left him. His mind raced with scenarios. If he intervened now, he could neutralize the threat quickly, silently, without causing unnecessary harm. But he chose to wait. He had learned that victory was not just about action. It was about timing, about reading the situation, about making the attackers expose themselves fully. And they were doing that with every careless laugh, every boastful shout, every step they took across his home. Outside, the neighborhood was still watching, though no one dared intervene directly. They could hear the chaos, the shouting, the crashes, but they did not know what was happening inside. The ordinary world continued outside these walls, unaware that a battle of skill and patience was unfolding just beyond their view. He didn't mind their ignorance. It made his task simpler. The fewer people who interfered, the more control he had over the situation. He moved again, slipping through the rooms with precision. His eyes scanned constantly, noting the positions of every attacker, memorizing their movements and identifying the perfect sequence for intervention. He didn't need weapons. His training had made him capable of handling threats with just his body and mind if necessary, and yet he prepared quietly, thinking of how he could use objects around him if needed. Every piece of furniture, every corner, every shadow became part of his strategy. The attackers continued to argue and bicker among themselves, frustrated by the confusion they had created. One accused another of missing a valuable item, another laughed at the destruction, oblivious to the danger above them. Their arrogance and lack of coordination were exactly what he had been waiting for. Each second brought them closer to the consequences of underestimating him. As he paused in a quiet hallway, he allowed himself another brief memory, a moment from his past in training, where he had learned the importance of patience and observation. The instructor had told him, "The moment you act without understanding, you fail. The moment you wait and watch, you control the outcome." That lesson had saved his life more times than he could count, and tonight it was still guiding him. He moved to a vantage point overlooking the living room. The attackers were spread out now, more focused on their own actions than each other. One was trying to climb onto the counter, another was picking up a chair to throw through a window, and the rest were scattered across the room. Their coordination was poor, their attention divided, and he could see the patterns that would allow him to regain control. His mind worked like a machine, calculating distances, timing, and angles. Every second of observation was an investment in the moment of action. He didn't feel fear or anger. He felt clarity. The chaos that surrounded him was not random. It was a puzzle to be solved. And he was the solver, the one in control. He thought briefly about the neighbors again. They had no idea who he was or what he could do. They only saw a quiet man living a modest life. He had chosen that anonymity for a reason. He wanted peace, a normal life, but tonight the past had caught up with him. And while the world outside saw only chaos, inside he was preparing for resolution. He could see the mistakes building, one by one. One of the attackers leaned too far over the railing. Another focused too much on smashing a piece of furniture, oblivious to the space around him. They were setting themselves up for a simple, precise intervention. He didn't need to rush. He only needed the right moment, the moment when control was entirely his. As he observed, he felt the quiet confidence of someone who had survived far worse. He remembered missions where lives depended on every move, where hesitation or overconfidence could mean death. That confidence wasn't arrogance. It was experience. And tonight it was exactly what he needed to turn the tide. He moved slightly, repositioning to a better vantage point. The attackers had unknowingly funneled themselves into a pattern, their own carelessness creating openings. He saw the paths they would take, the areas where their awareness was weakest. Every detail was clear, and every second of patience brought him closer to the moment where he could act decisively. He allowed himself one more memory, a quiet reminder of why he had left the past behind. He had chosen peace, chosen anonymity, chosen life beyond the battlefield, but he had also chosen discipline, skill, and control. Those choices were now converging, guiding him through the chaos in front of him. He would not act recklessly. He would act precisely, decisively, and only when the time was perfect. Outside, the sky darkened, the soft light of dusk giving way to night. The sounds of the neighborhood faded slightly, leaving only the echoes from his house. The attackers were unaware of the silent observer above them, the man who had been watching every move, calculating every step, and preparing for the right moment. And then, as he waited, he smiled quietly. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Their arrogance, their hate, their ignorance, all of it had set the stage perfectly. Soon, very soon, they would discover that this quiet man, the one they thought they could intimidate and destroy, was far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. Tonight, the hidden past would begin to resurface. The night had grown darker, shadows stretching long across the broken rooms of the house. The attackers were still inside, their attention divided between the destruction they were causing and their own careless chatter. He remained silent, hidden, moving like a shadow through the upper floors, his mind working rapidly yet calmly. Every sound, every movement, every misstep of theirs was being catalogued, analyzed, and stored. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He didn't need to rush. Patience had always been his strongest ally, and it had brought him here. The attackers were arrogant, overconfident, and completely unaware of the danger they were in. He could see it in the way they moved, the way they argued, and the way they laughed at their own destruction. They were predictable now, and that predictability was his advantage. He moved silently down a hallway, noting the positions of each intruder. One was near the living room, trying to lift a heavy chair to throw through a window. Another had climbed onto the counter in the kitchen, apparently searching for valuables. A third leaned against a wall, speaking loudly to the others, unaware that every word revealed their lack of coordination. Their mistakes had created openings, and he planned to exploit each one with precision. He paused for a moment, listening. The sounds of their movements were telling. One of them was heading toward the staircase, planning to check the bedrooms upstairs. That would be the first step toward isolating them, giving him control over who he engaged first. He didn't act immediately. Instead, he waited, calculating, ensuring that each decision would have maximum effect. In the back of his mind, memories of his Navy SEAL training came alive. He remembered drills where timing and precision had been everything, where one wrong move could cost lives. Every maneuver he had learned, every strategy he had practiced, every survival instinct had prepared him for this moment. He moved with confidence, not recklessness, knowing that his skills would allow him to handle the situation efficiently and decisively. He began with the man at the staircase. Moving silently, he positioned himself above the intruder, unseen, unnoticed. With careful timing, he struck, using the man's momentum against him, sending him stumbling harmlessly into a corner. The attacker shouted, surprised, but before he could react further, the protagonist had already moved to intercept the others. The kitchen intruder froze, startled by the sudden noise from upstairs. He turned quickly, only to find himself confronted by a man who moved like a shadow, fast and precise. There was no chaos in the protagonist's actions, no wasted energy, just calculated control. The intruder tried to resist, but the skill, discipline, and strength of someone trained for life and death situations made every movement futile. The man leaning against the wall in the living room realized too late that the situation had changed. The laughter and arrogance that had filled the room moments ago were replaced by fear and confusion. The protagonist moved through the space with careful precision, ensuring that no attack could be made against him or anyone else. Every intruder was being contained, guided into positions where they could no longer act freely. The attackers began to understand that this was no ordinary man, no weak victim. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and it was immediate and overwhelming. Their overconfidence had blinded them to the reality of the situation, and now they faced the consequences. Yet even as he acted decisively, he remained controlled, calm, and purposeful. There was no rage, no need for unnecessary harm, only strategic action to neutralize the threat. One by one, he used their own mistakes against them. A poorly timed movement, an exposed side, a distracted glance, each one became an opportunity. His actions were fluid and efficient, precise and controlled. The intruders were struggling now, realizing that they had been completely outmatched, not just by force but by intelligence and experience. Outside, the neighbors were watching in a mix of awe and fear. They could hear the echoes of confrontation, the shouts and sounds of struggle, but they did not fully understand what was happening. From their perspective, a quiet man had somehow turned the chaos into control, taking command of a situation that should have overwhelmed him. They stayed back, unsure of what to do, but witnessing the power of skill and discipline in action. As the situation inside settled, he moved to ensure that no one could escape unnoticed. The attackers had been disoriented, their overconfidence shattered, their coordination destroyed. He guided them into positions where they could be restrained or observed, ensuring that each one was fully contained. His actions were deliberate, measured, and effective, every step planned, every move intentional. He paused for a moment, breathing steadily, observing the intruders now subdued. The house was quiet again, except for the occasional shuffle of movement from those who had underestimated him. He could feel the tension slowly lifting, the control firmly in his hands. The danger was neutralized, but he remained alert, ready for any last attempt to disrupt the peace he had fought to regain. In the quiet that followed, he allowed himself a brief reflection. The calm and control he had displayed was not just skill. It was the result of years of discipline, training, and experience. He had faced situations far more dangerous than this, yet every element of preparation, patience, and focus had brought him to this moment of triumph. And yet, there was no pride in his thoughts, only clarity and resolution. He looked around his home, noting the damage inflicted by the intruders. Broken windows, overturned furniture, and scattered belongings were visible, but the chaos had been contained without bloodshed. He moved through the rooms, quietly assessing the aftermath, ensuring that every potential threat was fully neutralized. The house, though damaged, was secure once more. He thought about the intruders now, disoriented and realizing they were outmatched. They had entered his home with arrogance and hate, assuming they could intimidate or harm him. That assumption had been their greatest mistake. Their ignorance of who they faced, of the skill and discipline hidden behind the calm exterior, had led them to failure. And it was a failure that could teach them a lesson they would not forget. The neighbors, cautiously observing from a distance, began to emerge slowly. They had witnessed something extraordinary, an ordinary man turning chaos into control, skillfully neutralizing a threat that had seemed insurmountable. Whispers passed through the street, a mix of awe, fear, and respect. They didn't know his past, his experiences, or the life he had lived, but they saw the results, and the results were undeniable. He moved to the front door, opening it carefully to ensure no one could escape unnoticed. The attackers were restrained, disoriented, and aware that they had underestimated the man before them. He didn't shout or act aggressively. He simply stood there, calm and composed, observing the consequences of their actions. The contrast between his control and their confusion was stark, highlighting the skill and discipline that had brought him through this night unscathed. As the police arrived, alerted by the earlier call from a neighbor, they were met with a scene they did not fully understand. The intruders were contained, the house was secure, and the man who had been the target of destruction stood calm and collected, clearly in command. They could see that chaos had occurred, but the resolution had been achieved before their arrival. They questioned him, but he answered simply, providing the necessary information without elaboration. There was no need for theatrics. His actions had already spoken for themselves. The intruders were taken away, bewildered and frustrated, realizing that their plan had failed completely. They had underestimated someone who appeared ordinary, someone they thought would be an easy target. The lesson was harsh but clear. Appearances could be deceiving, and arrogance could lead to failure. After the situation had been fully resolved, he moved through his home once more, ensuring everything was in order. The damage could be repaired, possessions replaced, but the lesson had been learned. His life had been threatened, but through patience, skill, and calm control, he had regained it without unnecessary violence. The intruders were no longer a threat, and the house, though damaged, was secure. As he settled back into his chair, exhausted but composed, he reflected on the night. The danger had been real, intense, and frightening for anyone unprepared, but he had remained calm, strategic, and precise. His training, his experience, and his discipline had guided him through the chaos. And though the neighborhood would never fully know who he truly was, they had witnessed the results of a lifetime of preparation, skill, and resilience. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, the quiet of the night settling around him. The intruders were gone, the house was safe, and the neighborhood could begin to return to its normal rhythm. The night had tested him, but he had emerged in control, demonstrating that even ordinary appearances could conceal extraordinary capability. Though the night was over, he knew the world remained unpredictable. But for now he had restored order, protected his home, and ensured that those who had sought to harm him would not do so again. And as he looked around his home, quiet and still, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The calm had returned, and with it a sense of control and peace he had fought to protect. The night was finally quiet. The chaos that had filled the house just hours earlier had faded, leaving only the soft hum of the neighborhood and the occasional distant sound of a car passing by. He moved slowly through his home, surveying the damage one last time. Broken windows, overturned furniture, and scattered belongings reminded him of the attack, but he felt no fear, no anger, only a quiet determination. The intruders were gone, neutralized and exposed to the consequences of their actions. Outside, the neighbors began to emerge cautiously, peeking from behind curtains, stepping onto porches, and whispering among themselves. Their eyes lingered on him, the quiet man who had seemed so ordinary just hours before, now standing as the one who had turned chaos into control. There was awe in their gazes, a mixture of respect and disbelief. They had witnessed the aftermath, but they still did not fully know the truth of who he was, and perhaps that was for the best. He went to the front yard and looked up and down the street. The intruders had been removed by the authorities, and the police had begun to take statements from neighbors who had seen or heard parts of the attack. They asked questions, trying to piece together what had happened, but they had no idea of the silent battle that had occurred inside the house. He answered politely, calmly, giving only the necessary information, careful not to reveal more than needed. His past, his skills, and his experiences were not for them to know. Walking back inside, he began the slow process of cleaning up. It wasn't the destruction itself that bothered him. It was the reminder that even peace could be fragile. Even a home could be violated. He moved methodically, picking up shattered glass, rearranging furniture, and setting aside items that could be repaired. Every action was deliberate, a way to reclaim control over the space that had been invaded. As he worked, his mind wandered briefly to the intruders. They had come with hate and arrogance, thinking they could intimidate a quiet man, destroy his home, and leave without consequences. They had underestimated him completely, and yet he felt no joy in their failure. There was only a quiet sense of resolution, knowing that the threat had been handled without unnecessary harm. Justice had been served through skill, discipline, and careful action rather than anger or revenge. He paused by the window, looking out at the street. The neighbors were beginning to emerge more fully, some nodding in acknowledgement, others simply observing. There was a new respect, a subtle recognition that this man was not ordinary, that there was something beneath the calm exterior that could not be ignored. They would never know the full story, the training, the missions, or the life he had left behind, but they could see the results. And the results were undeniable. The evening air had grown cool, carrying the faint scent of rain on the pavement. He opened the blinds slightly, letting the gentle light of the street lamps filter into the room. It was a simple act, but it felt symbolic, a way of allowing the ordinary world to return while still remaining vigilant. The night had been a test, a reminder that peace could be fragile, but now it had been restored. He moved to the living room, setting down the remaining items he had been arranging. He could feel the exhaustion in his body, the tension in his muscles, but it was a satisfying exhaustion, the kind that comes from a challenge met and overcome. His mind, however, remained sharp, aware that the world outside could still be unpredictable. Even now, he did not let himself fully relax because experience had taught him that vigilance was never wasted. Sitting down in his favorite chair, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The attack had been sudden, violent, and unexpected, but it had revealed something important. It had reminded him that the life he had chosen, the quiet, ordinary life, could be disrupted at any moment. And yet it had also shown him that he was capable of protecting what mattered most, not through reckless force, but through skill, discipline, and calm control. He thought briefly about the neighborhood. People had been frightened, some had hidden, and others had watched in awe. They would likely talk about the night for weeks, imagining stories of what had happened inside the house. They might never know the truth, that a quiet man, hidden in plain sight, had turned a violent attack into a controlled resolution. Perhaps it was better this way. The less people knew, the safer he could remain. The quiet returned, the hum of the neighborhood blending with the distant sound of a dog barking and the occasional passing car. He felt a sense of accomplishment, not in pride, but in the knowledge that he had acted correctly. He had protected himself, his home, and the neighborhood from harm without letting anger or hate guide his actions. Discipline had been his tool, strategy had been his weapon, and patience had been his greatest ally. He walked through each room once more, ensuring that everything was secure. Windows were closed, doors locked, and any potential points of vulnerability had been addressed. The house had been violated, yes, but it was no longer in chaos. Order had been restored, and with it, a sense of control that had been temporarily lost. Every movement, every adjustment reminded him that peace was something to be actively protected, not passively assumed. As he settled back in his chair, he allowed himself to consider the intruders once more. They had been arrogant, careless, and unaware of the danger they courted. And while he had neutralized the threat efficiently, he knew that the lesson they learned would linger. They would remember this night, the quiet man who had outsmarted and outmaneuvered them, and the realization that appearances could be deceiving. His thoughts then turned inward, to his own life and choices. He had chosen peace, anonymity, and a quiet existence. That choice had been intentional, a way to leave behind a past filled with danger and conflict. And yet life had a way of reminding him that even peace could be fragile. The night had been a stark reminder of that fact. But he had faced it with skill and control, and for now that was enough. He thought about the lessons this night had reinforced. Patience, observation, discipline, and calm control had been the keys to his success. Anger and impulsiveness would have led to chaos, but careful planning and awareness had restored order. The night had tested him, but he had emerged stronger, more aware, and more capable of protecting what he valued. The neighborhood was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. Lights flickered on in houses down the street, cars moved quietly along the roads, and the distant sounds of life continued. Yet for him, nothing would ever be completely ordinary again. The night had shown him that danger could appear unexpectedly, that even the quietest life could be disrupted, and that preparedness was not just a skill, but a necessity. He moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. The simple act felt grounding, a reminder of the ordinary life he sought to maintain. He drank slowly, savoring the calm, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The night had been intense, filled with fear and danger, but it had also been a demonstration of his ability to remain composed, strategic, and in control. Sitting back down, he allowed himself a small smile. The attackers had been removed, the house was secure, and the neighborhood could once again feel safe. The night had tested him, but he had risen to the challenge. And though the world outside would never fully know the truth of who he was, he knew. He had proven to himself that he could protect what mattered most, that he could navigate chaos with precision and calm, and that the skills he had once relied upon in life or death situations were still very much alive within him. He looked around his home, at the furniture, the broken glass, and the quiet stillness that had returned. It was not perfect, but it was safe. And that safety was the most important thing. Life would continue. Neighbors would speak of the night in hushed tones, and he would return to the quiet routines he cherished. But he knew that he was ready for whatever might come next. The night passed slowly, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. He stayed awake a little longer, ensuring that everything was as it should be. The intruders were gone, the neighborhood was safe, and the house, though damaged, was restored to order. He could finally allow himself to rest, knowing that he had acted with skill, precision, and calm control, and that the chaos had been turned into a lesson for all who had underestimated him. As he finally lay down, exhaustion pulling at his body, he reflected on the events of the night. He had faced danger, observed with patience, acted with precision, and restored order. The intruders had been neutralized, the neighborhood protected, and his life reclaimed. And though the world might never fully understand the quiet man who had lived among them, he did not need them to. He had proven to himself that skill, discipline, and calm control could overcome chaos, and that even the most ordinary appearances could conceal extraordinary capability. With that thought, he closed his eyes, allowing sleep to finally claim him. The house was quiet, the night calm, and the world outside moved on, unaware of the storm that had passed and the silent strength that had restored peace.